don't know. It's kind of strange because, no, because actually I had no dealing with any of people that my father worked for at all. We were little kids.
How old were you when your father stopped working?
I was in high school. He always wanted to be a painter. And my Grandpa Beebe forbade. At those times, Sherman Williams would train you because they wanted to sell paint. If you wanted to be a painter, they show you how to do painting. And there were places on Long Island, which you may or may not remember, but there would be a field of hundreds of different colors, all painted, that Sherman Williams, the paint companies, would have out because they were testing to see what would last longer, what color would go, and whatever. So forth.
I don't remember.
It was like a form of these
swatches,
of swatches of wood of millions of different colors that they would. But Grandpa, because it was lead in paint, and so Grandpa Beebe did not want my father to go into painting because it was dangerous and so forth. So how he ended up with Mrs. Dean's, I really have no idea. I don't remember at all. But eventually, he did want to go into painting and always liked it, and spoke to Uncle Myron, a friend of his childhood buddy, and said he would paint his house for him for free if Uncle Myron would buy the paint, because he wanted to see if we could paint a whole house. And Mr. Mr. Bailey decided that he worked for ABC, and he wanted, they were thinking about, they hadn't had one go to sports yet and so forth, so he wanted to do his own sports network. And he started out a company called Sports Network, and this fellow that I mentioned before was somebody that was a smart engineer and all, worked for PIX, and brought him in as chief engineer, and Mr. Boso and I stayed in touch. And when I started in broadcasting, I started at WPIX.
So you were what was your role?
Eventually I became operations producer for live shows, and did that for a number of years and so forth. I worked for different firms in New York. The sports network thing was interesting because it was the first time that they started doing what we would call curve service TV, where you would actually bring a remote truck to a location. This was not very popular. Now it's very, very common, obviously. But,
so was it news or?
No, it was primarily sports. Mr. Bailey wanted to. I always felt that I was lucky to be at the beginning and changes of so many things. That, for example, I was going to be a scientific farmer. I was going to go into chemistry. I was going to go into agriculture. I was going to go to Cornell or Syracuse in college, and I took college courses in high school. And but it was the era of your show of shows, and television was first coming in. And we used to go up to Grandma and Grandpa DeVries's, who had one of the first TV sets in West Ceil. And we were told that we don't watch television on Sundays. So there again, it was what we were brought up. We don't watch television on Sundays. But I got interested in how all this, and why I don't know. And eventually, I really decided I wanted to work go into television. And I remember it was a big deal. My mother and father had to take off work. They had to come in and talk to Mr. Wank, who was principal of the high school at the time, to allow me not to continue my college education courses in school, Regents diploma at those days, because I wanted to go into broadcasting. You know, he said, you know, that there's no, television will not be a big thing. It's not going to
Boy,
let
he was right.
And seriously, what he says, what you need to think about is if you're not going to go to college, you go into air conditioning, because air conditioning is going to be the big thing and so forth and so on. But my
He's
mother,
right about that.
I feel like air conditioning is the ruination of our society, my personal self, but you know.
but my mom and dad were very good in encouraging me to do what I wanted to do, and my sister also. My sister,
Yeah, what does she do?
she works, believe it or not, now for Historic Hudson Valley, up in the Rockefeller area, up in
Oh, that's nice.
up there. Her husband, Bob, who was passed, was the minister, believe it or not, of Mechanical Hills Church for a while for the Rockefeller family up there. But
That's interesting that you have these connections.
yeah.
It's very interesting.
You're talking about school, no, what? Go to college. In those days, I wanted to go into television, and so there weren't any colleges that offered degrees. There was nothing available at all. There were schools, and somebody asked me recently, formally, you know, where, because I always put down secondary education, because I did have a secondary education. They wanted to know specifically the name of the school and all, and I said, well, the name of the school is the School of Radio Technique, and everybody goes, oh. But it was the only school that was legitimate. It was on 57th Street, New York, that taught television, had a real television studio, had real cameras, and I also, you know, say, in my class was Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman and I went to school together. And also...
He's a great actor.
Well, I'll tell you,
He's great.
Gene Hackman's story, when I was working in broadcasting in New York, over on 10th Avenue, which is all the film area and all, we worked for Unitel Video over there. And there was a place, restaurant, it was called the Slate, you know, Slate was the name of the restaurant, it was a showbiz. And we all always used to eat there. And I'm eating upstairs with my friends from Unitel Video and all, and they said, you'll never guess who's downstairs. Gene Hackman's down. And at that time he was a famous actor. I said, really? I went to school with Gene Hackman. So I went downstairs, went to the washroom, and went by his table, and I said, hi, I'm Jack Beebe. We went, and right away, whoever, the guy with him stood up, to his bodyguard, I think it was somebody.
Geez.
He was shooting a film over in that area. And he said, oh yeah, we did. We went to school right down the street. I said, yeah, right on 57th and WOR. And it was funny because, you know, then the guy sat down again, and we talked briefly, and I said, well, you know, good to see you, blah, blah, blah. So I went outside, and coincidentally, to meet my friends after we paid the bill and all, and his person he was with went to pay the bill, and he came out, and we stood together, like, and we talked about going to school together. I mean, his two classmates, he said, remember so-and-so, it was, again, back to the girlfriend, there were only three women in the school. And I said, yeah, remember Mrs. Hortense Gelpy, her name was Hortense Gelpy.
What a name.
Mrs. Gelpy was an older woman who was sent to America by Fidel Castro to go to school to learn all about television. She was our classmate, to bring all of her knowledge back to Cuba, because Cuba knew nothing. So in my class was Fidel Castro's right-hand lady and Gene Hackman. So we said, do you remember, her name was Virginia Adair, I think it was. He said, I dated her. I said, you dated her, remember? And she had that party thing where, and I said, the two Canadian guys, I said, they started television up in CHCH in Hamilton, Ontario, and we're talking about, and it was like, and then eventually this other guy came out and, let's go back to work. But so Gene Hackman and I were just talking about, but that's where we went to learn. And I eventually, time passed, and I'm digressing a little bit, but when my son was terminally ill, he always loved Superman, and so Superman came out to visit him, And that was always a big thing. And I remember having a picture and saying, hey, here's Gene Hackman was playing the villain in all the Superman movies and all. I said,
Oh, yeah, I didn't know.
they said, here's a picture of Gene Hackman with a lampshade on his hat. So it was like the class picture of so that's the proof that we went to school together. But there wasn't any any schools in those days. But so I went to work for PIX, WPIX, and then eventually the Ted Steele show was there, and WOR was coming out of a long, big strike period with the musicians and all, because in those days WOR had live shows that were actors and actresses on staff and so forth, and they had all these drama shows and all. And there was a big thing that the unions got involved in all, and there was no music at all, and they really wanted to get back and everybody, mend all the fences and all, so they approached Ted Steele at PIX to come over to WOR and eventually bring back live music and make peace with the unions and all and so forth. So the whole Ted Steele show left to go over there. I was in the operations department at PIX, a young kid, brand my first job and all. And I got to know them all from there, and eventually went over, and her name, a lot of people know her as the Nightbird, Alison Steele, but she was Ceil Loman in those days, and Ceil and I became very, very good friends. Saved our lives a number of times. She saved mine a couple, and I saved hers a couple too. So, that was an interesting period too, because the producer of the Eloise McElhone show at PIX was Barbara Walters. And Barbara Walters was the producer because her father, Lou Walters, owned the Latin Quarter. So Lou Walters was a big shot on Broadway and had all the Broadway stars, and also his young daughter, Barbara, had connections to her father. So she was the producer of the Eloise McElhone show. And
what was that, an interview show?
Yeah. And eventually, a lot of us had been in and out of employment, including Ceil, who became Ted's wife, Alison Steele. But at one time, Barbara Walters had gone over to NBC as a producer. From PIX, and she was like low end on the Today Show or something or other. I mean, and she and her husband at the time, I met her and her husband at the 59th Street Bridge, in Manhattan. Believe it or not, to go to Ted and Ceil's secret marriage when they were married in Bucks County. So I have pictures of Barbara Walters dancing and stuff, all at the farmhouse and all. So it's really weird how we, all have, intertwined and whatever. I have a picture of Alison Steele. When I needed employment, she put pressure on Ted years later to hire me at WINS before Westinghouse bought it. And Ted did, and I remember when I was vice president of Epilepsy Institute in New York, we wanted some celebrities, and she was pretty well known at that time as the Nightbird and all. And she came in on the board of Epilepsy, because I asked her to. So, and then when we opened up the studio at Unitel for MTV, we had this monstrous party, and the two guys who owned Unitel at the time said, "Oh, can you get Alison Steele?" And she came, just because I asked her to. So,
wow.
And she was a big shot at the time, and I have a picture of her.
She remembered.
Of her and me by then, and then eventually she passed, and I kept in touch with her sister for a while, but even though she became famous, we all looked out for each other. And in
So
many
it's
different.
when they get famous, but they still
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
remember the people.
And to be at the cusp of, I mean, when we were, and eventually, as I was starting to say, I went over to WOR, I learned a lesson, which I tell all young people. I learned a terrible, terrible lesson. So I was a teenager, what did I know? So I went over and talked to Ceil, to Alison, and she said, we need a producer, we need somebody to come in and work on a team show. We know this. I said, well, I'd like to come over. So she said, so she talked to Ted and said, he wants you to start next week. So I, as a teenager, go back over to WPIX and say, I'm leaving. Well, there was bitter feeling because Ted left PIX to go to WOR, and PIX didn't like it, and they had to substitute and put in other people, Alan Freed, and not Alan Freed, Alan Ludden, who was actually Betty White's husband at the time, and other people they put in there. But the PIX people really weren't happy that Ted left to go to the rival company in the same time block also too. So I go to PIX management and say, I'm really going to quit. I'm going to go back and work in the A&P. I remember saying, okay, so I'm going to leave, and I need to leave this weekend. Well, so I left on Friday and went to work at OR on Monday and worked for the Ted Steele show for a number of times and all. Time passes, I get drafted, I go overseas, I come back, and this and that. So I said, gee, I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe by law, I did eventually go back to WOR, but I thought, I'm going to go ice capades. I'm going to do something different. I want to, see, broaden my horizon a little bit. But I knew a guy that was working for PIX and for the Yankees and whatever and so forth. And they were looking for a producer for the Yankee telecast. I thought, this would be great. And I know the people. And I remember being interviewed in a bar under Yankee Stadium. That's where my interview was. Yeah, I have 2 innings off. Let's go downstairs and talk. So I had my interview there. So I got the job. Everything's fine. When can you start? I can start. I'm just out of the Army. I'm free to to go and do.
So what do you do with the carnival?
Well, right now we're working with a game. We've always been. One of the things I'm involved in is the National Showmen's Association, which was started in 1938 by the Hammond family, who owned the Steele Pier in Atlantic City and so forth. And I'm the lay chaplain, actually, for the member chaplain for the National Showmen's Association, which is show people from this area primarily. It originally was Coney Island, Palisades Park, as well as Long Island and so forth and so on, New York area, and a lot of people moved away and so forth. I don't know, I was always interested. It was,
So you're the chaplain for the carnival?
well, no, actually for the National Showmen's Association, I'm the member chaplain, lay chaplain.
Is that like a traveling job? Like
No,
you go around to different
no. Just, we're basically all from Long Island. Originally it was New York State, New Jersey, and so forth when it started in the 30s. Back in the World's Fair time, 39, 38, 39, the club started with Mr. Hammond, George Hammond, who owned, as I said, owned the Steele Pier in Atlantic City and was very involved in. They wanted an East Coast group because Palisades Park was involved, Coney Island was involved. There were different various shows on Long Island and New Jersey and so forth. They wanted a group to get together to promote the good and welfare of the business and do good for the community and so forth and so on. So I've been a member for a number of years.